I think from Abu Dhabi, but I think also within the UAE, we can say that modern is as opposed to traditional, or breaking away from the traditional. Traditional was very often what we may refer to as vernacular, in the sense that vernacular is architecture without architect. Its vernacular is architecture by the community rather than by a professional. It is built with materials and techniques that are local, from the environment, from the context. And it is a very true expression of the culture and the society in a very direct way. We have then modern, which is not that. We have architecture that is inspired by the international developments in modern times, in terms of design, in terms of ideas, in terms of materials. And then we have the transition period between both, where we have architecture that is built with modern materials, but still the typology, the organization of space, the way it's lived in is quite traditional. So, and I think from Abu Dhabi, in Abu Dhabi in particular, I think it's very clear that modern architecture was really to do with this vision of establishing a modern nation state, where, you know, you are talking here about, for the first time in the UAE, you are talking about, you know, a big hospital. You are talking about a culture foundation where, you know, cultural events will happen. You're talking about rest houses and clubs and swimming pools.
So the infrastructure of modernization.
Yeah. So this kind of, but also because before the establishment of UAE in 1971, it was different. There is this, I think, this inspiration of building a modern state, you know, and unifying the different emirates. We see this, like, for example, the Abu Dhabi bus station, for example, where it was important for the first time in the history of Abu Dhabi to connect in an efficient way with the other emirates, but also with the whole Gulf region, and to make this, you know, practically possible. So we have, for the first time of the, you know, in the cityscape, we have this bus station where it really serves this purpose. So it is a modern function, but is also associated with this idea of establishing a nation, establishing a country. So I think in Abu Dhabi, this is very well seen everywhere, because it is the capital.
That's, I think, interesting, because perhaps, I don't know if it applies to Dubai or not, but what Hossam you're saying is actually applies to Sharjah, in the sense that the 70s architecture was trying to develop a vocabulary that would be cross-emirate, so to speak. So it was trying to look at, I mean, there's so many different examples of modern architecture from the 70s, but one thing that is common to them is that they are looking at regional attributes of architecture to be reconceptualized in modern materials. As opposed to, I mean, the time period we're looking at is 71 to 89. As opposed to that, the previous decades, the Sharjah airport, which is one of the first airports in the region, was actually in the form of the Sharjah fort. So it was very emirate-oriented, the city-oriented. But when we look at the 70s buildings, they are a little bit more generic in terms of their architectural character. And even the developers who created modern architecture with modern new material, concrete, and revived the wind towers for air circulation of staircases, as in the example of Sharjah, they were taking an inspiration from an element that is common to all of the Emirates, the wind tower that came from Persia, but it got integrated in most of the cities within the United Arab Emirates. And I'm wondering if Dubai has the same experience.
You know, we had the traditional architecture, which goes for 100 and 200 years old, with the coral stones and gypsum, up to, say, in Dubai, we had the first cement building from 1945, when cement was imported from India, but it was on a very low way of usage.
Because it was expensive then.
1955, it became much more used. And you can say from 1955 until 1971, when the first building code was out with Dubai Municipality, we had this kind of intermediate. Cement was much easier to be used. It was coming in ready packs, and then the reinforced concrete came. But still we find houses with courtyards, but it is cement. And we have wind towers made from cement. So it was a kind of this intermediate until the 1960s, because Dubai even developed before the discovery of oil and production of oil. We had architects, whether some of them they studied in France or in UK or Americans, and the international kind of design of Art Nouveau. We do have some of the villas which are somehow affected by these architects, and still it is on our list from the 1960s and 70s. But then when the
list meaning the protection list.
Protection list, yeah, because already in Dubai Municipality, in our department, we have made a law that in a building which has an age of 40 years old, then it should go through evaluation, and we evaluate this building architecturally, from planning wise, economically, tourist wise, social life, and if it gets something like 70 points out of 100, then it goes on the list. And we have the A grade and B grade and C grade. A grade is something like Fahidi Fort, Sheikh Saeed House, which is very important, and so. And then if it is 80 or 70, it comes less, which you can do a little bit of changes, but you have to protect the outside of the building somehow, like what we see in most of the European cities.
And you're saying that some of the modern buildings are on the protected list.
Some of them are on. So, for example, now we are in 2014. So any building which was built by 1974, which is after the establishment of UAE. And some of them, if they have a very high importance, something like the Trade Center, for example, although it is 1979, but it was the first skyscraper building in the Middle East with 39 floors. So that is already on the list. So it should be protected as the first skyscrapers. Some of the housing projects which was done in the 1970s by late Sheikh Rashad bin Saeed Al Maktoum, also as some samples, we want to keep this for the coming generation, because this is the evaluation of architecture in the city or in the country, how it went from the coral stone to the gypsum courtyard and then to the modern housing and modern building. And nowadays we consider Burj Khalifa and this as modern, but I think after 50 years, we are thinking now of registering Burj Khalifa as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, because you know, it's a building with a lot of OUVs in it, outstanding universal values. So the code, when it came in 1971, then
the building code,
at that time, even at the municipality, we had most British architects and engineers. Somehow it was taken from the British codes, even for the building. That's why the idea of the courtyard, the setback between the boundary wall and the villa, to extend the size of the sikkas, the alleys between the houses, all of this, it affected much the construction, in addition to the planning of the city, because the first planning was done 1968, and then the roads came. Before that, it was camels and donkeys and so on, and now we have the automobiles, 2 ways to go and come. So that affected much the planning of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, and all the other cities, I think, in the Gulf. So it had kind of effect on the architecture of the.
I mean, we read about modernism and modernity in Europe, and we see this very strong wish to break away from rigid rules and traditions that became, like, you know, quite tedious. Like, you know, you have to do one of the classical orders if it's classical, or the way you build according to one style or another. But also there are things like, for example, the wish to house a big number of people in a one go after the Second World War, and all these issues that brought modernity to the stage in the West. Whereas in the Arab world and in the UAE, it's really to do with catching up with the rest of the world rather than, breaking away from a tradition that we are kind of like thinking it is not valid anymore for today. And this is why I would say that sometimes you get a villa that is designed in a very modern way, according to the architectural vocabulary. However, it is used not much different than how a mud, a fort or courtyard house or arish or a mix was used from social and functional point of view. Because socially, I think, and culturally, there is not this very abrupt break away from traditions. When we talk about modern way of life and modern way of doing things, it's really to do with the materials, the techniques, the way of organizing things, but not really that much with the social aspect of things and the cultural aspect of things. And I think this is why probably you had this very smooth moving towards modern, in the sense that you still had the courtyard house, but built with reinforced concrete. Until now, you still have the majlis, where that's where the main socializing happens. All these things, because it was a very kind of smooth move from traditional to modern, rather than saying, okay, we want to turn a page, and we have this incredible belief in science and in the future, and we were held back by so many traditions. We want to start anew.
So I think maybe we can move on to the next issue of, you used a phrase, modern becomes old, to the eye, to the sentiment, and in age. So when modern becomes old, what do we do with it?
I think it's important to remember that the city is a place for memory, and sometimes you forget here, particularly with the wealth coming from oil, and it's very easy for the city to renew its skin every 10 years or 20 years, and there is nothing to prevent us from this. And this is why I think it's very important that what used to be modern in the 70s, we need to hold on to what we think is significant for the collective memory and for the identity of place.
So from your perspective, we should safeguard early modern, or all layers, as you said, of modern architecture, so that there is a continuity. And city, as you said, is about collective memory, so the collective memory is retained.
Yes.
Are there any other reasons? Or, you said that Dubai has already in place mechanisms to enlist modern architecture to safeguard us. So what are other reasons other than collective memory? Why should we save modern architecture, or the modern architecture that has become old?
Well, the most important, as Dr. Hossam mentioned, that this is the history, the pages of the history which we have to keep. Maybe I myself, now I am 53, but the stages of the city, comparing Dubai of the 1950s and 60s with only 50,000 people population, and today with 2.2 million population. So this fast development of the cities of the Gulf, whether Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait and Bahrain, it affected much.
Now, when these buildings become old, both of you are saying that they should be preserved, some of them at least, to give a sense of time, to give a sense of collective memory, to give a sense of how city has developed. Are there any other reasons why they should be saved or not?
Many, in my opinion, I am a conservation architect, so I have hundreds of reasons for why keeping a building. For example, I think it is important, it's environmentally friendly. It is, to start with.
How?
In the sense that, actually in traditional common sense, this is why in pre-modern times everywhere in the world, we never needed conservation charters or regulations, because people had common sense and they would never demolish a building unless it is unsafe and there's no, but they will actually develop it and reinvent it, rehabilitate it and live in it. you know, but when with modern buildings, with modern times, with modern life, with all these techniques and technologies, and planners sitting on a drawing table and can actually wipe away a full, you know, neighborhood, if not a full city, it became important to say, hold on, listen, don't wipe away even if you can build a nicer one, because actually it's, you know, there are values.
The 70s building had more environmentally sensitive details in them, in the sense that they didn't have that much glass like the ones on the Sheikh Zayed Road, which are being emblematically repeated in all the UAE. So there is this environmental component. So that one of the reasons for saving them is to show that all modern architecture was not environmentally insensitive.
Sure.
Early modern architecture was environmentally sensitive. So that's one reason. The other reason, as you said, is that these buildings are emblematic of the transition phase from tradition to modernity, if you want to say. I think I'd like to add a third reason through which I want to bring in the case of Sharjah, is that Sharjah has a very unique situation. The Bank Avenue, as you are must be familiar with, has the Al Hisn Fort in the center, flanked by a row of transitional modern buildings that were environmentally sound, that were 8 to 9 stories tall. So they're not that tall that they totally take away the human scale. And at the same time, they provide a very interesting modern backdrop for a recompiled vernacular tradition representing fort. And I find it very intriguing that at the same time as the modern buildings went up, the fort was given a modern framework. So basically, as Timothy Mitchell wants to see, that modernity had a stage of tradition, the fort sitting right in between it. And at the same time, now when we look at that situation, the fort itself has a stage setting of modernity around it. So that dichotomy, to me, is very, very pervasively, authentically Sharjah. That at the same time, Sharjah wanted to retain its culture, its cultural identity through its historic building, even though that historic building was recompiled 10 years after the modern buildings were built. So in the sense of timeline, that fort is newer than the modern buildings.
Okay.
So, but it reflects through its architectural typology, through its construction method, a vernacular tradition.
Right.
So I think I would add another reason to why these transitional modern buildings of the 70s and the 80s need to be saved is because they provide the stage for tradition to be reconstructed or restored. And you have the dichotomy, which is what UAE is all about. A nation that wanted to progress, a nation that wanted to unify through architecture, but at the same time have its own internal breaks, which were kind of neutralized somewhere in the 90s, and then we go breakless after that. So I think that becomes a very interesting...
Things, it goes very fast here.
Yeah.
You know, demolition went very fast in our cities in the Gulf. And then the break came, no, we have to look back and we have to keep our history and architecture. Then it went very fast in the development of these houses in the 70s and 80s. And then we had the break, no, we have to go back and restore some of the historic buildings. And the beginning of this century, it went very fast with the modern towers, and you know, it was going crazy. I remember
international towers.
International.
Yeah.
I remember at that time in 2000, between 2004, 2008, I was the director of the projects department in the municipality. And at what time we had more than 200 projects at one time only. So there was no time even to design or think about the design. And as many of the architects, they were saying they were just copying.
Cookie cutter. Yeah.
And copying from the architecture magazines of Japan or somewhere. And because there was not, everyone wants to build a tower. And then we say, Alhamdulillah, it was good with this economic crisis that at least now more thinking is done. To the buildings, to the architecture, that it should be suitable to the climate, better materials to be used, it going now into kind of green architecture and things. So that is another break. Now, we should not go this fast with the planning and the development of our cities. We should think about the architecture, what is the suitable architecture, rather than going very, very fast. But always we are looking back. That is good. I think that there are some mistakes are done and try to take care of these problems in a nice way.
buildings are not only about facades, it's not about volumes, it's also about the ideas, the inspirations, the aspirations, the dynamics of the society that brought these buildings. And this story is so important to be remembered that brought a building here or there. So I was mentioning this vision that was created, that Sheikh Zayed, late Sheikh Zayed, had about establishing a modern nation state. And you can see this all along in Abu Dhabi, throughout the Emirate. And so, for example, for the first time, you are talking about a public library, a facility for the community as a public library, as a performing arts place, as a visual arts place, the culture foundation. The idea of creating a very dynamic hub for the community for cultural activities and cultural
public buildings.
Public buildings. You have the issue of healthcare, establishing a hospital that is actually to take care and actually to have records for the different people and to actually take care of families and so on. And also the idea of public housing, which is fairly different from how it happened in Dubai, because in the case of the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, there were so many nomadic people on the move, and Sheikh Zayed wanted them to settle so that he has a community in the modern sense where they can be educated, they can have a job that it is, the setup that you would expect in a city. So he began to build these shabiyat, these national houses, where it's this smooth moving from the traditional to the modern, where the early shabiyat were basically a courtyard house, not much different from how it used to be with Arish or Coral
These
Stone.
early shabiyat are of the same time period, 70s, the transition that
the earlier ones were earlier than that,
Okay.
but throughout the 70s and even the 80s.
They continued.
But we have different types that evolved
Okay.
and became more complex maybe. But the whole idea was basically to give a family, a big walled space with some rooms around, just how they were used to develop their encampment wherever they settled as nomadic. And then that developed into what we can call a villa. Very interesting, for example, that we have these rest houses spotted all over the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, where they were built by the state for people who are traveling. Again, this is a very modern idea. Some public swimming pools, amazing. In my opinion, that's amazing if you imagine the way the generation who were introduced to these swimming pools. So this idea of leisure buildings for the public, for the community. Again, that's part of the vision of building a nation state, of establishing a modern community. And but also ideas like the Officers Club, for example, where you're talking about you have a modern army, and part of the setting is that you have a facility for the officers' families. And again, you are talking about a very very unusual type of building.
Unusual with reference to the vernacular tradition.
Yeah, for the earlier types of buildings. So what I'm saying is that these are stories that these buildings say to the young Emirati or the Emirati who is going to be born still, not yet, about their country, about what is this place, is about. And I think it's so important.
So basically you're saying that these early modern buildings are showing how architecture was used, modern architecture was used, is in establishing a nation.
Yes, but also they reflect all sorts of other cultural and social phenomena that you can teach pupils in a book or two about it, but it's totally different when they actually can see a swimming pool built in the 70s. And actually, with that style and the way it was, or they experience a bus station, built in the 80s, where, with the architectural style and everything, and actually understand, because the style will tell that this is from the 80s. So they can see these different layers of the city, of the history of the city, these different chapters of the history. They can feel it rather than just read a line or two in a book, which may not mean much.
So it's a physical history of modernization.
Yes.
You know, at the beginning, 1970s was mainly the time where the rulers, Sheikh Zayed, Sheikh Rashad, Sheikh Sultan in Sharjah, other rulers, they started to build up the cities. You know, we're coming up from a very small community into
from a settlement
to an international city. So all the services you needed, hospitals, schools, libraries, parks, all of these things, public toilets, came mostly in the 1970s and the 1980s. Some of them, they had this kind of, and we had to bring architects from all over the world. So that's why I think in the 60s, 70s, 80s, if you go in Jumeirah, you find the Japanese architecture, French architecture, Greek architecture, housing mostly even, you can say, a Spanish type, and then you can find the Chinese, Iranian, Indian, so, and all of this because of the backgrounds of the architects who are coming. You know, maybe if you go to United States, they have to learn somehow the architecture of there, but here, people were coming, and as soon as they come, they just start to design their buildings. Mosques, for example, if we see at the mosque which was constructed in the 70s and 80s, we have Fatimid style from Egypt because it was architect from there. You have some Pakistani style because the architect was from there. You have some local, starting with some local architects who started to take the traditional elements and put it in the mosque. So as Dr. Hossam said, when you look at the city, you can see very clearly these are 60s, these are 70s, these are 80s, and that's how the architecture is developing. The towers, the same thing. You know, the late Sheikh Rashad, may Allah be pleased with him, he always had in his mind to make Dubai as the best cities of the world. His Highness Sheikh Mohammed always mentioned that when he was young, in the 60s, when they were going to London or to Paris, always they were thinking when we will be like these cities, to see the Champs-Élysées, to see Oxford Street, towers, buildings. But then this idea was reflecting on the rulers and the decision makers here, and that's how it started, Sheikh Rashid, to build, how he thought about building the trade center, the 39. And after that, with the wealth which was there and people who were coming, number of population increasing, so that's why it started to build skyscrapers, more buildings, housing building, whether it was for the locals or for the people who are coming, apartment buildings and apartment offices and office buildings for the people to come, and that's how it developed. Some of them, they were taking from the local architecture some ideas. For example, Dubai Airport, for example, the second stage, we say, because 1961 was the first, then we had 1983 and others. The idea of the tent, the idea of some of the elements of the local, like Burj Al Arab, for example, the idea of the sail of the Dow and these things was taken. Dubai Municipality, the current building of the 1971, it was also a very nice that it went even into kind of international competitions for the buildings to come, and it was won by a Japanese architect, which he took the idea of the oasis, the water, the tent, and the air circulation. I think it's a very nice design that even nowadays, if you look at it after 35 years, you still find that it is a modern building. How the air is circulating and the building itself, the courtyard is there, the covering not with the tent fabric, but with the steel structure. So all of these ideas were there, some of them to take from the local architecture and how we should develop, because again, architecture will not stop at one age. You know, always we have to develop our thinking, our abilities, creativity, to be in relation to the culture and to the traditions of the place, but with modern materials, modern ideas to develop this architecture. Even nowadays, looking at Burj Khalifa, for example, the architect, he took the idea of the desert flower and the domes of the Jumeirah Mosque and tried to make this highest tower of the world into the ideas of the local architecture which was available in this area.